When you're sad, you don't act like yourself. You gotta think of everything while you're writing it. Gotta keep the right punctuation. Gotta make sure capital letters. Gotta use phonics. Difficult. I've written to 200 people. I'm trying to communicate with them so they can pass my letter on to the Prime Minister, Keystone. If we don't have communication, then we can't share our ideas. When everybody comes together, they share their ideas and make it fun and happy.
So we're here to look at the focus of moderation of writing, and I want to start with an introduction. I'm Amanda Griffiths, a director at L.E.A.D Academy Trust and across L.E.A.D Teaching School Hub. And I'm really privileged to be joined by Paul Singleton, who's going to introduce himself and just share a bit of his background.
Hello Amanda, my name is Paul Singleton. I work for Keystone Academy Trust and I work in their school improvement team. And a big part of my role at Keystone is that I am the local authority strategic assessment lead. So it's my responsibility to make sure that all schools in our locality are meeting their statutory requirements when it comes to phonics, the multiplication check and end of Key Stage 2 testing.
Oh, that was a comprehensive introduction there, Paul. And I just want to say how privileged we are to have you join us with this podcast today. And I think firstly, it's really important to just unpick the definition of moderation. Definitely. To be really clear, what we're meaning by that phrase and by that term. So should we just start by sort of thinking about, what's your definition as an expert in the field of moderation? What would you say is the true definition of it?
So I think we have to think about moderation in the context of education, and I think it can mean different things, and I think it can be used in different ways. So for the purpose of today, we're thinking about it from teacher assessment and how moderation is used within that teacher assessment cycle. So a teacher will have assessed a piece of writing and they'll have made a judgment. And what the moderation is doing is it's checking the accuracy of what the children know, what the children understand, and also what the children can do. And it's then an activity between teachers and leaders whereby they're checking how well the work has been assessed and the accuracy of it, and that will normally be around a framework so that we know that everything is accurate and we're in line with national standards, because there will be a criteria that we have to moderate against and we want to make sure it's fair for all pupils. Now, I've already introduced my role in that I'm responsible for statutory processes, and we know that at the end of Key Stage 2, children are moderated every 4 years within writing by the local authority. So we need to be thinking, and some of the things we're going to talk about today is around why it's so important to get that moderation right across the whole school, because we don't want to leave it just till year 6, because we want it to be a process which is well ingrained across the school. And we're going to be thinking then today about the purpose of writing moderation moving forward.
Absolutely. And I think it's fair to add that, I've been the strategic lead in the Priority Literacy project across Nottingham and Derbyshire. And actually that's how this has evolved in terms of the support and the tools available to support teachers in that process. And obviously we'll be sharing resources and tools with you to support you further within that area. So to move on from that, Paul, I just want to come on to, what is available and what has been available through the project for teachers and leaders, across Nottingham and Derby.
So I feel that teachers across Nottingham and Derby have been really fortunate to be part of this project in the resources that they've been able to access, and also the training that they've been able to access as well. So if I start to talk to you about the training, that's been led by local authority moderation managers. So those people within the local authority that are trained by the Standards and Testing Agency, so have a real comprehensive and deep knowledge of that moderation process. And I have led some of those events, and I know my counterparts across Nottingham City and Derby City have also led them as well. What those moderation events have allowed for is really great CPD for teachers. It's allowed them to network, it's allowed them to come together, and it's allowed for that professional dialogue around the standards of writing. And as a teacher myself, we know how busy the school day is. Absolutely. And we know how full on it is for teachers. So to have that luxury of being able to come out of school, network with other colleagues and talk about writing is really beneficial. And I think teachers have left those moderation workshops having their judgments validated, but importantly, what they've also managed to gain is the next steps for pupils. What do they need to take back to the classroom to help the children to progress even further? We've also been able to access, as part of the project, moderation grids. So there's a really clear framework for them to moderate against, and they know in those non-statutory year groups what they need to be assessing and at what point.
Just tell me a bit more about the moderation grids, because I think that's been quite a significant tool for schools to use and to, support them in their journey of moderation. Do you want to just say a little bit about those?
So they were formulated by the Lincolnshire Local Authority moderators a few years ago because we recognised that there is an end of Key Stage 2 teacher assessment framework. And there is also an end of Key Stage 1 teacher assessment framework. That's now optional, but many schools still use it. But schools were finding it tricky to know how to assess writing against a similar style of framework in years such as 1, 3, 4 and 5.
Absolutely.
So we used the national curriculum as our starting point, and we followed a very similar structure around creating those grids so that teachers know what to look for when it comes to those non-statutory year groups. And I know from leading the events, the feedback from the teachers has been really positive because it's allowed them to have something to look at writing and know they're on the right lines.
Absolutely. It really gives rigour to,
Absolutely.
that delivery in the classroom. And I think, it's been powerful for all teachers and leaders. And there's been a strand of it in relation to those not achieving at the expected standard, those pre-key stage standards. So what has been the work around that and, the resources available there?
So as a local authority team in Lincolnshire, when the pre-key stage standards were introduced, we had the framework for the pre-key stage standards, but we felt that we wanted to show schools what it looked like in the real life context of children's work, because that's what teachers need. They need to see it in real life and they want to see what that evidence could look like. So we put together an exemplification book for reading, for writing and for maths from pre-key stages standards 1 to 4 to show them what that evidence could feature in the collection when they're making those judgments, those children working below the standard of the test or the teacher assessment framework. And what the project has allowed for is for all schools across Nottingham and Derby to receive a copy of our exemplification materials, which teachers can then use in their pupil progress meetings, in their moderation activities that they're leading in school, so that they know the judgments for those children who are working below national expectations are as secure and rigorous as they are for those children working at or just slightly below.
And now more than ever, in terms of needs in schools,
Definitely.
I think that's a really critical tool to be aware of. And equally, pupils working at the expected standard and at the greater depth standard, you've worked really hard to pull together an exemplification of materials against both of those standards across all year groups. And I think, that resource is available and we'll obviously be sharing and signposting the website to access that. But in terms of the benefits of moderation, which you've talked a lot about for all year groups, what would you say are those key benefits of schools engaging with that moderation process?
So I think fundamentally the most important benefit is around that professional development that it offers for teachers. It really is the opportunity to discuss, reflect and unpick and consider children's writing, because we know the assessment of writing is not easy, it's subjective. And sometimes it can feel quite lonely and isolating having your class set of books and having to moderate and assess all of these pieces of writing. So by having rigorous and thorough moderation practices in your schools, it alleviates some of that pressure for teachers.
Absolutely.
They know they're on the right lines. We know that the judgments that they're making are fair and they're reliable, because what we have to be mindful is that it's not a year 6 teacher assessment framework.
Absolutely.
It's an end of key stage 2. So all year groups play their part for that final judgment that's made at the end of key stage 2. And it's really important that we understand that responsibility that we have as teachers to make sure that we are assessing accurately and the children are moving through key stage 2 with judgments that we know are reliable, and teachers can then use that to build on it year on year. And I think as well, the national curriculum is cumulative in that the skills naturally build on each other. So when we look at an end of key stage 2 expected standard statement of integrating dialogue to advance the action and convey character, for example, that doesn't start at year 6. That journey starts at year 3, well, previously in key stage 1 where they learn how to punctuate, etc. But it very much starts at year 3 and builds gradually over year 4, over year 5. So if teachers know the children have that security in the lower year groups, by the time we get to year 6, in effect, we're putting the cherry on the top of the cake rather than having to start from scratch.
Absolutely. And I think that exemplification portal has been critical in that for teachers to really understand that journey across, from year 1 right through to year 6, and have that understanding of the depth of knowledge at each year group and the skills required.
I think as well, though, it's also real children's writing.
Yes.
And it's really nice to see real children's work. And what we've also done as we wrote those exemplification materials is that we put a commentary. We looked at the features and we showed teachers how those features are used within the writing and then how we are assessing the writing. We've looked at the qualifiers which are in the framework of some, many and most, and how that might be represented, because often when it comes to teacher assessment, that's where we have some grey areas and some misunderstandings. So by using those materials, hopefully it helps teachers to know what it does look like from a national perspective.
Yeah, and it gives them confidence, it gives them clarity.
It also empowers them.
Yeah.
And that's really important, because when you feel empowered, you have that confidence to know you're on the right lines.
That's a great way to look at it. I absolutely agree with you. And I think, that the benefits of moderation, I hope, have come through there in terms of, your explanation of it. But, creating that culture for moderation in a school can be quite challenging.
Absolutely.
So, from your expertise and your background in this, what would you say are those sort of key ingredients? How do you create that culture for moderation?
So, I think it's about creating seeing it as a positive process. And it's professional development, as we've already outlined. It's not a rod to beat teachers with by any means. And we want to make sure that we're giving teachers the opportunity to celebrate and recognise children's hard work. Because I know as a teacher, I used to love going through the children's writing books and being able to see the progress that they've made. Because I'm sure you did the same trick I did, where you'd look at September's first piece of writing all the way to June and go, oh my word, wow, how much progress have they made? And when I go in my official capacity as a moderator, that's what I really want to get across to teachers, that we want to celebrate the children's achievements. And when I used to do it as a senior leader in a school, that's what it was about, highlighting what the children can do and what are their next steps.
Absolutely.
So to create that culture, then we need to ring fence it within our school day and our CPD calendar, because I know there's lots of priorities in school. I know that it's a busy day, but if we're not putting that precedence of how important it is, then it gets a bit forgotten about and it gets a bit lost within all the other activities that schools have to do when they're thinking about their CPD calendar for the new academic year. I think as well, when we're thinking about that culture, it needs to be an open, honest conversation with teachers. And we need to think about the balance of who's doing the talking. What we want it to be is that that teacher that's being moderated is doing the balance of talking, in that they're doing most of the talking, and the person acting in the role of the moderator is listening and asking really pertinent questions to get the best out of that teacher. But I also strongly believe that moderation and that culture in school, it should be robust and it should be rigorous, because if it's not, then it doesn't have the same emphasis that it should have.
Well, it doesn't serve a purpose at driving improvement. If it's too cosy and it's too, there is no rigour or challenge, it's how is it ever going to lead to change? What's the point, I suppose, is the bottom line of it.
Absolutely. And I talk about it being done in a safe environment for staff and a respectful environment for staff. But like you've already mentioned, I always use a phrase when I train our moderators for statutory process: high support, high challenge, because at that point you do get the best out of people, because otherwise it does become a bit too cosy. Or the other way is that people fear it, and that's not what it should be about. So I always talk about moderation as well as that jewel in the school improvement crown, because it's everyday monitoring and evaluation, and you have that opportunity within the staff meeting, within the training day, within the PPA session where you may go in to join a moderation activity, whereby you're looking at what the children can do and what they need to do next. And that's why we want to do it, so that we can find out what they know and then think about what we're going to do with that as we plan forwards.
So in a calendar, you talked about sort of putting it into a school calendar across a year. So would you recommend sort of one session each term in a sort of staff meeting forum? What would be your recommendation, I guess?
I think it needs to be done termly, because you're going to have an assessment cycle within your school, and most schools will use a termly assessment cycle. That seems common when I speak to teachers: once in the autumn, once in the spring, once in the summer. So the teachers work so hard to complete that assessment of writing, so it seems natural to then want to benchmark and check the accuracy of it. And what I used to do when I was a senior leader in a school is that I used to build it into my pupil progress meetings.
Oh, I like that. Tell us more about that.
I would ask our teachers to bring their books to the pupil progress meetings, so that there was that element to discuss progress, but also moderate the judgments, so we could all see firsthand what the children can do and what they need to do next. And that's what I really stressed to our teachers, in that, yes, I wanted to validate the judgments, I needed to check they were right. However, the 95% of the conversation was around, so what are you going to do about this? What's next? And that worked really well, because from a point of where teachers were a little bit nervous and anxious about it, we moved really quickly to teachers being really quite open and going, here's my books, and let's check that they can do it, and I need a bit of advice as to what to do next. And that really embedded that culture for us.
And in staff meetings, would you, obviously schools vary in size and in context, but would you sort of think it would be beneficial to have teachers challenging each other from different year groups in that sort of staff meeting session? Would that be your recommendation?
That cross-phase moderation is really important, because within the curriculum, it's about not just knowing your year group, it's about knowing what comes before and what comes after, and how everything aligns so that the children do make the progress. Because what the pandemic showed us is that gaps mean that children move through school without the basics in place, and then when it comes to more complex learning, they struggle.
Absolutely.
So we want to make sure that the teachers know that work really well, from the year group they're inheriting to the year group that they're sending away to the next teacher. That's
a really good piece of advice really for schools to know how to sort of structure that.
I think as well, though, the final part of the culture, which I think is important to embed within a school, is not being insular and being outward facing. Because I know within Lincolnshire, we lead a full calendar of events for schools to come to training. And what I know is that those schools really appreciate that opportunity to hear from someone else who does the role regularly and be up to date with what the latest messages show. Because I know from my own moderator training through the STA is that every year there's a slightly different focus, or there's something new that comes in, and you've got to keep yourself fresh.
Absolutely.
And you've got to keep yourself current. And by attending workshops, or it could be within your MAT or federation or locality of schools, what you're doing is you're seeing a wider sample of pupils, and you get new ideas, and you see that's a great text to use, or oh, I'm really struggling to think of how to make the children feel engaged by that topic. Someone else may have done it, and you can steal ideas. That's what we need to do in education more. Magpie, because there's so many great ideas out there.
Completely, and that professional generosity piece and sharing good practice is really, really critical. And I think, those events, from having, been and seen what they look like, the benefits are vast for teachers, and that is replicated across Nottingham and Derby as well, in terms of the events that have happened through the priority literacy work, and equally, hopefully will continue to be the case through the moderation work within those areas. I think it's, teachers need to feel secure in what they're doing, and that's hard sometimes, particularly if you're new to role.
Definitely.
I think the benefits are even greater in going out to those events and working with others.
You get that reassurance, and you do hear it from the horse's mouth, because there can be misconceptions, there can be things that get misinterpreted. So it allows you to ask that person who is going to either maybe come into your school or train the people that come into your school, well, what is the answer to the question that I've got? And you can literally see so many teachers just breathing out that sigh of relief once they know that we're human as well, and fundamentally we want the best for the children. That's why we're doing it.
No, I completely see that. And you go into hundreds of schools in terms of your role, and what would you say is the most effective example of visits that you've had? What are the common things that you notice?
So from a statutory point of view, when we lead our Year 6 moderation, our Year 6 moderations in June time, then it's really important that teachers understand what the process is. They've read the guidance, they've understood the guidance, and they know what to expect from the process.
It's not a shock.
No, it's not a shock.
It shouldn't be a shock.
No, it shouldn't be a shock. And they're well prepared for it. Not that they've spent hours and hours and hours post-it noting or photocopying samples of work or doing any other complex system. That's not what I mean by that. It means that they've thought through the pieces that they want to show, and they know how those pieces meet the framework.
Absolutely.
And what they've also done is they've used those exemplification materials to check that their judgments are in line with national standards, and leaders have been involved. They've quality assured the process, because my view is that if the leader is confident in knowing the framework, if a leader understands what the process should entail, that means they can also offer that high support and high challenge to teachers. They can maybe say to a teacher, oh, you're being a bit harsh on that judgment. Can you not see this? Can you not see that? And we are ensuring that the children are getting the judgments which they deserve in that regard.
That's a really important point, actually. And leaders wear an awful lot of hats in schools. We really appreciate that, and the stretching capacity and so on. But to have that depth of knowledge to offer that challenge, I think, is a really important point that you've shared there. Because, to really understand the detail, to be able to support and challenge, just as you've said, I think, is the thing that's going to drive standards forward and make that difference. I think it's really critical, because how can you challenge anything if you don't have the knowledge?
And writing is complex. Writing is hard. And particularly when you start looking at the Year 6 greater depth standard, you've got to have a really secure subject knowledge in order to be able to assess it accurately. And that's what we also see in the successful visits, that teachers really have that subject knowledge. And what they've done is they've got a well-embedded curriculum. And also, and I'm really passionate about this, and I think it's really important, is that in that they have got the children to write for a purpose, and the children understand why they're writing and the impact that it will have on the reader. So rather than the writing feel forced or formulaic or a little bit writing by numbers,
Yeah.
you can see that through high quality teaching, a well embedded curriculum, and a really good understanding of the framework, how it all aligns together. And obviously, that's all built around high quality texts and experiences and opportunities for the pupils. That's where we see the
standards in
the best
terms
standards of writing. And what the teachers have done as well, and the curriculum leads, is they've thought about how that curriculum needs to be organised, and they've thought about the balance of the collection so that there is fiction, there is non-fiction, and it's not 7 weeks of fiction.
It's well structured.
It's well structured, it's well sequenced. And also, they have attended training, they do know what to expect, and they feel confident knowing that the process will be fair. And what we often find as well is that teachers can be quite nervous at the start of that process. And I've been both sides on the tables. I've been the moderator, and I've been the moderator, and I've been the moderatee as well.
Yeah.
And I've sat in my front room with books out, just double checking my judgments to make sure they're correct. But by the end, loads of teachers say to me, I quite enjoyed that because I got a half a day out of school to sit with another colleague and have a professional dialogue about writing. And how often do we get that luxury within school? Because the day is just so full on, and while we want that opportunity, it's often hard to ring fence that time for that opportunity.
Yeah, absolutely. I think you've covered a real range of elements there that really shares the benefits of moderation and really talks about and unpicks, what the most effective moderation looks like. But what would you say are the common challenges that you see? And I think to unpick the challenges sometimes strengthens our practice further.
Absolutely.
So, from your experience, what would you say are those challenges that you've identified or have seen? Or
So we find that while there is a national framework at the end of Key Stage 2, and you've obviously got the national curriculum as well, which the framework takes the key objectives from, there are varied expectations, and there can be some issues around that reliability of teacher assessment because people can interpret it in different ways. And often where that happens is whereby they've not attended relevant training and they've not kept themselves up to date.
So they're also almost isolated, and it's sort of pigeonholed, blinkered in terms of,
or they don't quite have that subject knowledge to know what that looks like at the right standard, and that can be a real challenge. But by attending the training, by using the exemplification materials, that really helps to overcome that issue. I think as well, some of the other challenges of internal moderation which schools may carry out, or it may even be within your clusters or mats, is a lack of rigour within the moderation meeting. So I always say, who's leading it and what's going to be the focus for that moderation session? Because you do need someone who's going to keep everyone on track.
Absolutely.
And you do need someone who's brave enough to challenge in a supportive, in a safe and a kind way. Well, I want you to show me the evidence that that child can do that, because you've told me, but you haven't shown me.
Yes, yeah.
And
really finding those examples of evidence, the strands of evidence that is justifying that judgment.
And work in that really systematic way, whereby...
That's interesting. What do you mean by that?
So what I mean by that is, it can sometimes be very easy just to read a piece of writing and then automatically make that judgment in your head without...
Based on the handwriting.
Based on the handwriting. We can often look at a beautiful piece of handwriting and go, that must be graded at.
Yeah.
Because it's beautifully joined.
Yeah.
But when you start to read it and unpick it in more detail...
And the components and the grammar...
You suddenly go, no.
No, it's not.
There are issues there. And alternatively, those pieces where the handwriting isn't always as strong, you often go, that's actually a really strong piece of writing. So I think another challenge as well is, and I've mentioned this previously, is getting teachers that aren't in year 6 in the non-statutory year groups to understand that they play their part as well. And if they're using maybe a slightly different approach to their moderation, in that they may use a more best fit approach, where at the end of year 6 and the end of Key Stage 2, it is a secure fit. And they do need to have met all of the statements and show that across a collection of writing. So you've automatically got 2 people who are running different races. Because one's got a different starting point. So I would always say, and this is my personal view, that in those non-statutory year groups, by following a more secure fit, then you know that reliability of the framework is there.
Completely agree.
And I think then the final challenge is around that insufficient evidence.
Okay, what does that mean? What is that sort of...
So it might be that there's not enough opportunities for writing. It might be that it's too scaffolded, it's too modelled for them. It doesn't independently show what the child can do for themselves. Or it could be that that balance isn't quite right, like we talked about earlier.
Too heavily scaffolded,
yes,
potentially.
Or there's too much non-fiction, or there's too much fiction. And the teacher's also not prepared. They've not come to the meeting with the right materials. They've brought their brand new book, which has only got one piece of writing in, and the other 7 or 8 are back in the cupboard somewhere else. So that makes those discussions really challenging, because unfortunately in a statutory process, we have to see that full collection of writing. And it's getting people to understand that. It's not just reliant on what they can do in one piece of writing.
Absolutely. And you've touched a lot throughout on the kind of independence of writing, and, you know, what that means is potentially hard to interpret. Tell me more about the independence of writing. What does that look like from your perspective?
So that must be one of the most commonly asked questions that we get asked. What do we mean by independent writing? Now, the Standards and Testing Agency are really clear on it, because it's in their teacher assessment guidance, which is updated annually. And that's always the starting point to go to when you want that definition of what independent writing looks like. But so if I break down the components of that STA definition, first of all, independent writing is likely to be independent if it emerges from a starting point and the child has had an opportunity to rehearse and talk about what they're going to be writing about. So it might come from a text you're studying, it might come from a visit, it might come from a curriculum experience, for example, because we want the children to show their writing at their best. And
we want them to be inspired.
And we want them to be inspired.
And them to be sort of passionate about something that they're writing about, really.
But if they've got no background knowledge and it feels a little bit cold to them, then cognitively that's quite overwhelming. Absolutely. And it would be overwhelming for me as an adult to just be expected to write something cold. I need time to practice, I need time to rehearse, I need to feel confident in what I'm writing about. So the children can have that opportunity to discuss, and they can have that opportunity to rehearse. It is making sure it's not too scaffolded. So you've got to make sure, you've got to think about that in the back of your mind. But the national curriculum does state that that can be done when it comes to writing. What independent writing is also gives children an element of choice. So it might be that they write the next chapter. It might be that they change the perspective of the character, so that they've got a structure which they've understood and based it upon, but
they're applying it
in a very different way. And it shows how they can then apply it within the grammatical structures, within the vocabulary, within the punctuation, etc. I think as well, it can be that editing needs to take a big part in independent writing, because I edit my writing. I'm sure you edit your writing as well.
I do. Lots of scribbles all over it.
You can't get it right first time. And independent writing can involve that by the child, or they could have an editing buddy, or within a group of children, for example, where we would say it's not independent, is where it's been done by the teacher. You as the teacher have said to the child, you need to add in a semicolon here, or you need to reword that sentence because it's not clear enough for a reader. That will be too directed. And also as well, another element of independent writing is whereby you can seek out classroom resources. So you can use dictionaries, you can use thesauruses, you can use statutory words on the wall, but the child has to do that for themselves.
Yeah.
However, they need to be trained to do that. And I think sometimes when we think about independent writing, we just expect it to be done from day one.
Yeah, absolutely.
And it needs to be built in.
Yeah, that's interesting because that's a real misconception, I'd say, of whether you could do that or not. And I think it's really great you've clarified that.
And I would always train my children in the autumn term. It would be very little independent writing because I would be training them to use the resources. I would be training them to edit. And if we want children to have good quality writing, they need to be taught the skills. And if we're always saying, do it for yourself,
How
do they know? And I think when it comes to an independent piece, what you've got to remember is that you don't have to assess every single element in an independent piece. It could be, for example, the composition elements are independent, but you've provided a word mat or a spelling bank.
No, that's interesting.
For the children to reduce that cognitive overload, and you assess the compositional elements, but you know the spelling has been supported, so you just think, right, in a future piece, I need to make sure that I get the evidence that the child can do the spelling side for themselves. And I've always done it as well because I keep talking about having that collection of writing and having sufficient pieces. But if I saw a gap or a misconception that a child had, even in an independent piece, I'd tackle it there and then because my worry would be it would be a repeated error.
Yeah.
And sometimes it's easier to sort it out at that point, make a note and say, oh, I helped Amanda with her punctuation there because she hadn't quite understood or grasped parenthesis.
But then in the next piece,
remember that and think, right, I need to now see she can do it for herself.
And isn't it great before they start the writing, knowing that Amanda couldn't do parenthesis, for example, you know.
And that's why we assess pupils. Fundamentally, it's to know what they can't do and to help them to be able to do it later on. Where writing is not independent, and the STA are quite clear about that, is where it's been modelled or heavily scaffolded to pupils. And that might also lead into pupils copying it or paraphrasing it. And I think you've got to be careful that they're not reliant solely on what that model is and they're completely and utterly using that structure for their own piece of writing.
You see a whole class of identical.
And it is, and it's absolutely that. And I know from a moderator perspective, you look at a piece of writing and you think, I've seen this before, this rings true, or this structure is identical in every child's piece of writing.
Yeah, it's dangerous, really.
And also I've had it whereby the first paragraph, they've modelled it, they've paraphrased it, and then the child has gone for independent. And you can just see the difference. And again, that's fine. You just put a note to say the first paragraph, we work together.
Okay, as long as that's there then.
But you've then got to think, if you do that every single time, you'll never have
true independence.
Yes, you'll never have that complete piece of writing to check that the child can do it all for themselves.
That's really useful.
Just some other bits and bobs around making sure that they're not using spell checkers. If they're typing work, for example, those features have been closed down. And also, it's not a detailed success criteria, which is really telling them what to include. You've just got to be careful. Yes, it's to prescribe. That's what you've got to be careful about as well.
No, really useful. Thank you, Paul. And, you know, you have a piece of writing presented to you in terms of moderation. You know, how do you go about assessing it?
So
what does that look like in terms of a process?
To do it properly, you've got to work systematically, as I've already talked about, and you've got to give it the time it needs. So the first thing I do is I want to find out about the context because I want to know how they got there. I want to know what it's been about. So that's about the teacher telling me. Then it's about, in my own head, looking at the genre of writing and thinking, well, what features would I expect to see? And what feature, and how might the child be using them within the different standards? And I want to check that those elements match the topic. Then I'm going to look at the piece. And what I always do, or ask the teacher to do it sometimes, or a bit of a balance of both, is I read it out loud because I want to check it's coherent. I want to check I can understand it. I want to check it's logically sequenced because, again, that's why we write, so that someone else can find out what you want to tell them. So that's been a huge part of our training about checking the coherence. Does it make sense? And making sure those elements fit together. Then what I'm going to do is I'm then going to get my grids out and I'm going to work systematically. I'm going to look at the statements and I'm going to look at how those features fit to the purpose of the piece of writing.
And that's why the grids are so powerful, because you can sit with them, you know, as a resource, you can sit with them and unpick that piece of writing against it.
Absolutely. And that's where that professional discussion comes in, that support, that challenge. But also as well, what you've got to be careful is you don't feature spot at that point.
Okay.
You don't just go, there's a comma there, tick. You don't go, oh, they've used a conjunction, tick. It's how have they used that comma? Does that conjunction work appropriately within that sentence? Because if it doesn't, it's not meeting the purpose. And the risk is you're writing by numbers.
Yeah, it's a formula.
And it's a formula. And that's not what it's about. Because we want to get children to understand that they're writing for an audience, that someone's going to read it, and they know why they're doing what they're doing.
Writing for purpose.
Absolutely. Then I would look at any edits or additions that the child has put in. And then finally, I would come back to the spelling and the handwriting. And sometimes we get a bit bogged down in spelling and handwriting. That's the first thing we look for. So I try, and sometimes it's hard, I'll be honest, to look at that last.
Yes, yeah.
Because
good advice.
Then I unpick, you know, is the spelling meeting the framework? Is the handwriting meeting the framework? Let's look at it in a bit more detail. So that's the process I would go down. But when I used to do it as a class teacher, fundamentally, I'd also be thinking in my head, right, what are the gaps? And what am I going to do about that? So that, do I need to change my long-term plan? Do I need to take a guided group on this so that I'm using that information well to inform my next steps?
Absolutely. And I think that's, you know, again, that's the whole purpose, isn't it? It's informing next steps, driving improvement.
Yes.
And obviously the statutory moderation piece fits in at the end of that entire journey.
Yeah.
And something that you've touched upon, you know, throughout in terms of assessing writing and the moderation of writing, and it's a really sort of hot topic in terms of writing, is the concept of transcription. And I've heard a lot of people in education talking about transcription in writing. You know, what does it mean, really? And, you know, how is that important in the moderation process?
So we talk a lot about this in our training, and the first thing I always come back to, before I even talk about frameworks or moderation or assessment, is the national curriculum. And the national curriculum expects teachers to teach those two elements of writing, and that's composition and that's transcription. So they're both equally important, and it is about getting both of them right so that we get successful writers. When we look at those two dimensions, the teacher assessment framework also focuses upon transcription and composition. But what I would say is that transcription is key to support that composition and that coherence of writing, because children will often get stuck if those transcriptional skills are not secure, because they've got the ideas in their head, but they can't get it down on paper. And then the writing loses its flow.
It leads to frustration, it leads to opting out, it leads to so many challenges, I think, if that's not well embedded.
Absolutely. And fundamentally, it's cognitively overwhelming. And those transcriptional skills are cognitively demanding for pupils to learn. So if we can embed them and if we can secure them right from the start, it releases that pressure on our working memory, because those skills are embedded into long-term memory. The children have that fluency or that automaticity within those transcriptional elements. And we need those pupils to have that. so that then they can focus on the flow of the writing and the ideas they want to get down, and it doesn't become disjointed. And I think sometimes when we read children's work and it feels disjointed, it's because something's gone wrong at the transcriptional stage.
That's interesting.
Which means they can't get their ideas down in an eloquent and an articulate manner in which is already going around in their head. What I would say as well when it comes to transcription, there is guidance within the teacher assessment framework that the STA produce on spelling, and spelling should be evident throughout the collection. But when we're assessing it, the framework very much focuses upon those statutory words within the national curriculum. But we have to remember, we have that end of Key Stage 2 spelling SATs test, which will test them on many of the rules and the patterns which they have to learn across Key Stage 2. But when it comes to a statutory moderation point of view, if those statutory words aren't well embedded throughout the collection, and what I'm not saying is that all of them have to be there by any means, then we can use spelling tests, we can use dictation activities, because what we don't want to do is get children to shoehorn words in, or statutory words, just for the sake of it, because again, that spoils the audience and the purpose and the intent of why we're writing. With handwriting, also that does need to be evident within the collection. And while you can look at handwriting books and handwriting pieces, they are quite clear that we need to see evidence of handwriting within the independent pieces of writing as well.
And it's critical that, you know, children have that opportunity to rehearse, you know, to practice and to, you know, embed that skill.
Absolutely.
Fluency, as you said, is critical.
So I think for me, it's thinking about, particularly with handwriting, for example, it is making sure they've got that fluency and they have got good formation. They know how to then position the writing. They then know how to join the writing. So they get that nice, fluent, legible style when it comes to writing at speed. But there's so many prerequisite skills to get to that point. And that's whereby, if you get your moderation practices well embedded under a clear framework in your non-statutory year groups, all those elements can be checked by the time they get to year 6.
And is that unpicked a bit further in the pre-key stage piece in terms of supporting that? Because I can imagine, you know, pupils operating at that end, the transcription piece is even more critical. Am I right?
No, you're absolutely right there. For those pupils working within the pre-key stage standards, there's definitely a real focus upon transcription for those pupils, because we want to try and reduce that cognitive load for them, and we want them to work on those real having security of those basic fundamental skills, so that when they're ready for those more complex elements of learning, they're not being challenged because they can't write it down because they don't know how to spell it or they don't know how to write it. And the more they practice as well, that will help with that fluency.
And it gives them confidence.
And it gives them
at the end of the day to lead into...
And pride in their work.
Absolutely, and that desire to write.
Yes.
Because, you know, it can be a significant challenge if you don't have those basic skills to support you.
And those pre-key stage standards as well, when it talks about the compositional elements, it talks a lot about it being oral composition.
That's
and the importance of talk. Because what we have to make sure is that children can talk well so that they can write well.
Absolutely.
And if they can't rehearse or hold that sentence in their head, then they're not going to be able to get it down clearly on paper.
No, that's really good advice. And I think that, you know, that oracy piece has been a significant part of the priority literacy work. And I think that feeds, you know, significantly into the world of writing and children being able to articulate their thinking first as part of it. So, impact is something that, you know, we all aim for. And so in terms of moderation, just a final sort of question really, you know, how do you know, what, if it's effective in terms of that moderation approach, what impact would you expect to see?
I think the first impact is everyone's on the same page and you've got that enhanced assessment practices They're well embedded in your school. Everyone understands them, and they work like clockwork, and they're really smooth as the children move through the school. And as leaders, but also as teachers, you've got that realistic picture as to where your pupils are at, and that then allows you to plan forwards really accurately within your school improvement planning, and also prioritise what CPD staff need, because you know exactly what the issues are. They might be transcriptional issues that are coming out of the moderation sessions. It might be oracy that's coming out. So if I know that, I can put that on my school improvement plan. I can feed that into my professional development that I lead. Also as well, you do have empowered teachers because they see that moderation as a transparent process. They're also being held to account, but they're in effect holding themselves to account.
I like that.
Because they want and they know what's best to help the children to move forward within their learning. They are supporting that progress, and they can see that progress that the children are making, because what it will do is the impact will be shown in that the curriculum will allow the children to know more and remember more, and it's being well implemented because you're seeing that in the impact of the moderation that you're leading.
Yeah, and I think, you've really provided so many sort of tips and opportunities for thinking around the topic of, writing, how to embed effective writing, what the tools are to support that. So, you talked about the portal, you've talked about, exemplification of standards within that. You've talked about, frameworks that go alongside it for each year group, the challenges involved and the pitfalls in terms of writing and, exemplification of writing. And I think, I just want to say a huge thank you for your time in sharing, your thinking, your expertise. And equally, all of these resources are there for people to access and to use and to, support them in structuring that calendar of moderation and events that are out there to drive moderation of writing forward. And I don't know if there's anything you want to add as a final point that I might have missed.
No, I think it is just making sure that those practices are well embedded in your school and everyone's on the same page. And like I said, it's that jewel in the school improvement crown.
What a great final point there. Thank you, Paul.
Thank you, Amanda.